Hi, everyone. This is Charlie Pacello. I'm your host of the Council, and boy, do we have a very, very distinguished guest for us today as we are here for the Veteran Summit Special Series that the Council has been in collaboration with the Trauma Sensitive Awareness Foundation to help you to find out some of the best resources and healing modalities for PTS, TBI, sleep disturbance, flashbacks, family problems, and so much more. And this has been an honor and a privilege to be a part of this series. And we are so excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Bessel Kolk. He has spent his professional life studying how children and adults adapt to traumatic experiences. He translates emerging findings from neuroscience and attachment research to develop and study a range of effective treatments from traumatic stress and developmental trauma in children and adults. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score. Folks, this is one of my favorite books. I've highlighted it everywhere. It has inspired me. It has moved me. It showed me things about my own trauma that I had experienced, and it made sense. This is the book that I needed to help to make sense about the things that I didn't know what was going on in my brain and my body. I can't recommend it more highly. His website is www.besselvanderkolk.com. Welcome to the Council, Dr. Kolk.
A pleasure to be here.
Sir, it is an honor to meet you, to speak with you. And I would love for you to share with us a little bit about your first experiences working with veterans.
Well, the opening chapter of my book is that first encounter, actually. And it's very dramatic, and I'm very pleased that I remember it. And that's that. I started to work for the VA. And the reason why I went to work for the VA is because I wanted to have very intensive therapy myself, which all therapists should have. And the only person who would pay for that would be the VA. And so people said, don't join the VA because the VA is all about people wanting to get compensation. I said, well, that's why I'm joining the VA also, so that I'll be at home. Huh? And so I went to the VA, not expecting much, and I met all these really interesting guys who were all about my age, oftentimes very good athletes, very smart, etc., etc. And something had happened to them. And something had happened to their bodies. And these were very powerful, athletic people, and they looked collapsed, and they looked sort of unengaged. And then something would happen, and they would blow up and punch a hole in the wall and become extremely angry. And that was their chief complaint most of the time. And around the same time, I was beginning to have a family, and I had babies at home who also threw temper tantrums. And when my babies threw a temper tantrum, I wasn't very worried about it because I knew something was going to happen to make those brains grow and to make it happen. And then I met these guys who were like 32 years old, something like that. And they did the same thing as these babies did. They said like, what the hell happened here that something didn't get? So that was my interest in neurobiology. And then this opening story is of a guy who came in after the 4th of July. 4th of July was a big day for veterans because of all the fireworks. He had been drinking in his office. He comes in, he looks disheveled, he tells me about his nightmares. I'm typical psychiatrist who hears one little thing and says, I have the answer to that. So I know how to treat nightmares. I give him a pill. He comes back 2 weeks later, he says, I didn't take your pills. And I say, why not? Offended, like a good doctor, you're supposed to follow orders. And he said, I realized that if I stop having my nightmares, the death of my friends will have been in vain. I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. And that statement, even as I say it, like, I get tears in my eyes just thinking about it, like, oh my God. And then he tells me the story that his father fought in Patton's army in the Second World War. Father was very proud of his military service, but his father could never pay attention to his kids. And his father would always say, "My friends who died in the war were better than any of you." So he talks about how his dad got stuck on his dead comrades. Here, one generation later, he is stuck on his dead comrades also. And I go like, wow, this is huge. And it has to do with loyalty, it has to do with love, it has to do with revenge, it has to do with guilt. And so at the same time, we're developing these biological models of PTSD. And it's very clear, it's much more complex than that. It has to do with identity, it has to do with belonging, it has to do with so many things. And so I just get blown away by those guys, and I very much identify with these guys. I myself, as a conscientious objector, I didn't tell that to my guys I was working with, but before too long, they made me one of their own, and I had to be one of theirs. So they gave me a Marine Corps corporal's uniform, so I could be one of them. And I really got a real appreciation of what they had gone through in a way. But what it really brought home for me is the issue of a deep sense of belonging and being part of something bigger than yourself that gets blown up, and that's very hard to leave behind. So one of the things that strikes me most, working with veterans then and still to this day, is that when he marries somebody, the people they marry is very as important as the friends they had in the war. And the war becomes a very big monster in your head, and it gets glorified. So I got a lot of respect for the U.S. Marine Corps, but at the same time, I'm a skeptic and I like to make fun of things. And I see all these guys my age driving around with Semper Fi stickers. So, yeah, it's very nice to be in the Marine Corps when you're 18 years old, but what have you done since that time? And so, uh, yes, I can really appreciate that you are very proud that at one point in your life you did something very important. But if that's the last thing you did, then something has really gone wrong. And so I get very preoccupied with how can you help people to appreciate what's going on with them, but to also re-engage with the present. And that trauma is, as time goes on, I get to appreciate more that trauma is not so much about the memory of the past, but trauma is about the difficulty engaging in a new life and a new experience. And so later on, one of my close friends is Stefan Wolfert, who you should have in your program sometime, who is a combat veteran who with terrible PTSD, who becomes a Shakespearean actor and who writes a play about his own war experiences using Shakespeare's language. It's a piece of work. And he organizes a organization called Decruit. And the way we connect to each other is that, he says the army was, in this case, the army, was very good in recruiting me for the army and preparing me for the army. Did a great job in boot camp, great job in basic training, but I never got decruited for civilian life. And that's very much, to my mind, a very big issue, is how do you reorganize your war-type brain, that brain is that's very good for war, but sucks for family life.
Yeah, it does.
So how do you change that brain so you
Yeah.
can really enjoy playing with your kids on the floor and not on some deep level be reminded about the kid that you blew away in Iraq and be unable to connect with your own kid? Yeah.
And I think that is one of the hard things that veterans, that when they come back from war or come back from combat or even service, is how do you start to fit back in?
Yeah.
And if you've experienced a lot of trauma or if you lost guys, like you said, that sense of loyalty that we have, that sense of camaraderie, the brotherhood, the sense of love that you feel of being people willing to die for you and you're willing to die for them. That's a huge thing for a human being. And
Oh,
then when your brain is in those environments, it changes. And
yeah.
so it impacts us how we're able to reconnect with people. And that's one of the hardest things that veterans have to deal with.
And it changes very profoundly. And I'm always concerned that the VA really doesn't pay much attention to the degree to which brains have been changed by the experience. And if you want to go on, be back in life, you need to change your brain
Mhm.
back to having a civilian brain. And that's a huge challenge.
It's enormous. And you've
Because
defined.
your brain really gets trained to pick up danger, to pick up the little thing, to pick up the snipers, to pick up. You become very good at it, but you are not very good in picking up. Oh, the fact that this leaf outside of my window is changing its fall. It's beautiful how the light is changing. It's falling in that.
Well, it is, and I think in a recent class that you had, you talked about how the brain changes and that the perceptions of like where you're at. I think it's the fear. You showed a slide about how the brain of someone with PTSD at rest almost feels dead inside. That when they talk about the trauma and the part of the brain that makes them, all of a sudden that part of the brain makes them come alive again and they
Yeah,
go on alert. And
yeah.
when you compare that to the control or normal brain, you see that it's actually opposite of one another. And
Right.
this is a recent study that you've
Oh,
done.
very recent. Yeah, may not have been published even yet. Yeah, yeah.
Could you talk more about how this supports some of the things that I think you wrote 30 years ago when you were talking about the Vietnam veterans? Because it wasn't it very similar to what you were discovering
Well, it's
back
not
then.
so clinically. So it's interesting that our technology with brain science is so good. So we have learned a lot in terms of brain science, very exciting, but we haven't really kept up mentally.
Mm.
Our mental understanding of what the process that happens in people, and how also mentally your whole mind get changed to not pay attention to small things and to not get pleasure out of small things. That hasn't been paid much attention to. But so what we saw clinically is that indeed um, people only feel alive when they are exposed to trauma. A good example is that I've been teaching for a while, not anymore right now, at the Foundation for Advanced Journalists at Harvard. And so I meet these war journalists who just come back from Syria and Lebanon and the Congo, and they've seen these horrendous things, and it just tears them up to talk about it. But when they come to Cambridge, Massachusetts, they feel terrible. There's nothing happening, and
Mhm.
they cannot get their minds around anything. Nothing means anything. And before too long, I get an email from them. They're back in the Congo, they're back in Syria, because when they are in danger, they feel alive.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and that's a real issue. It's not like, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. Like, how the hell do we reorganize people's brains so they can be here and get pleasure out of making breakfast for their kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
It's very tough. And if we don't, and that's what I love about your work so much, sir, is that you've been able to really look and see what's going on inside here and being able to understand, though, the body has such a huge impact.
yeah,
And that the trauma, you've defined trauma in these ways that trauma is an event that overwhelms the central nervous system and changes the way you remember and react to things that remind you of it.
yeah.
And you've also said that trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, it's the current imprint of that pain
Imprint. That's it. Huh?
and fear living inside of people.
Fear and rage and excitement. I mean, it's complex. And in some ways it's easier to talk in terms with veterans because it's not hard for a veteran to admit that it was also exciting to be in the war.
Yeah,
And I've never felt as alive
that's right.
as is happening. And so the horror and the pleasure are mixed together,
Yeah.
and and to just be able to make that a piece of your past is a huge challenge.
Oh,
And as you know, one of my favorite books is Karl Marlantes. Have you had Karl Marlantes on your show?
Not yet. I haven't had it, but I'm
His
aware of
name
it.
is,
Yeah.
he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Matterhorn, but then he wrote his book What It's Like to Go to War. And it's just a spectacular book. And he talks about all this excitement, etc. And how the journey home is such a tough journey. Tough
Mhm.
journey. Yeah.
Well, in the war zone, isn't it? I mean, our brains are combat. It actually changes, like you were talking about, the reward system in
Yeah.
our brain. And all it takes is one time for that to be able to happen. Can you explain how that happens and why that's significant to understand for veterans who are struggling with trying to figure out, how do I fit back in? What's wrong with me? What's going on?
So, it starts off with basic training, which, as you know, I've never had, you know, um, it's a very profound experience. And, you have a bunch of pimply, horny, not very well organized little kids. And 12 years later, you have some very competent kids who are able to do stuff, you know. And from what I know, it's not a fun experience, but boy, they know more about how to transform somebody into somebody else than anybody else. Huh? I mean, after 12 weeks of basic training, nobody looks like, and everybody's competent and knows what they're doing, and they have a sense of competence. And so that's a brilliant piece. The Romans found that out actually, and I know the history of that very well actually. Um, it's how the Dutch beat the Spanish in their War of Independence by learning about drills and basic training. Uh, Um, and and then so you have the sense of agency, camaraderie, and that's tied up with the war. What's important here is that the armed services traditionally have been a very powerful force in American life because a lot of kids who came from very bad circumstances were able to go to the army, get rules, get an identity, get skills, etc., etc. And for as long as your best friend doesn't get killed, or as long as you don't commit atrocities or any of these things that happen, uh, the army is by and large a very positive experience for most people in the armed
Mhm.
forces. Because the other thing that we ignored when we first started to talk about PTSD is we said it's all about the war, but of course it isn't all about the war, and we knew that back then also, but we sort of conveniently forgot it. Is that people join the service oftentimes to escape bad situations. And the data show that kids who go into the army or the armed forces, by and large, have much worse childhoods than your average population. And so the armed forces is a very good way of helping you to move out of that and to come into the world of predictability, insanity, incompetence, etc., etc. But if on top of that, then you have a war trauma, then you get this combination of what happened to you before and what happens to you in your newfound sense of identity and competence. And as you know, that can create all kind of very nasty things for people.
Oh, yes. And if you're not understanding how your memories are recorded and how they're stored in the brain and why the brain records a trauma differently than a
Yeah,
non-traumatic event,
yeah.
because there is a difference between that. And, like a memory of a pleasant vacation, if I'm going to a nice place and I go to Italy someplace, and I go to the Piazza Navona back there. It's a different, different experience.
I wish I had nightmares about the Piazza Navona.
Me too. So we have it records it differently. Why does the brain do that? Why is it different from a traumatic brain versus a non-traumatic?
It's a very important question, and I'm impressed how even most scientists don't know this. For a while, during all the false memory controversy, for a little bit people paid attention to it. Now, the old memory textbooks are back to memories are malleable and memories change, and we all make up stories in our minds, and that's how it is. I'm really impressed with how many details of my life. I remember the story that I tell about it, but I don't remember what happened. But that's how it is. And when I get together with my brothers and we talk about our childhood, we go like, that didn't happen. You grew up in a different family than I did, because our memories are very malleable and very distorted. But so something that actually I was not the first person to find it out, but I did a lot of work in it, is that what's wrong with trauma is your memories don't get distorted. So it's normal for your memories to get distorted. Yeah, so most people at a certain time in their life say, "Oh, I had a happy childhood." When you go back there and really think about all your details of your childhood, it sucks a good amount of the time. But it doesn't matter because you clean things up, you know, and that's what the mind does. It's sort of a little mind sweeper that cleans out the dirty stuff, and at the end you have a nice narrative about your life. It's all good. Uh, and it turns out that when you get traumatized, these memories become very precise sensory relivings. And so you see the image, huh? You hear the sound, you feel that sensation in your body just like it was. And so, in a way, trauma is the normal memory processing getting distorted, gone awry, and the memories don't get distorted. And so it keeps coming back, just like it was. And you start organizing yourself like, oh, I don't want to feel this anymore. And you do anything to push these things away. Huh? Most commonly, alcohol, very much supported by the armed services, unbelievable amounts of drinking, unbelievable amounts of drugging. And that's how you try to push these things away. And they work. The weird thing is the data, I know what the latest data is. I don't think people are quite as honest these days as we were back in the Vietnam time. I think there's a lot of distortion going on. There's a lot of cleaning up of things. I think people don't talk about the real stuff anymore.
I agree. I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah, being in it, I remember. We did. We covered it up with alcohol. That's what
yeah.
I certainly did.
And so, but what we found in Vietnam, for example, is that people who got addicted to heroin in Vietnam came back and they did much better because the heroin protected your brain against going in that state of complete panic and craziness, and it kept it calm. And most people who were addicted to heroin in Vietnam didn't continue to be addicted in America because you have such a thing as state-dependent learning or state-dependent memory retrieval. So as long as you were not in a jungle with a lot of moisture and birds singing and stuff, the state didn't come back and you didn't feel that stuff anymore. And so that alcohol and drugs are protective. I mean, they're bad, but boy, do they help to dull the pain. And then at some point you need to come to terms with dealing with the pain. And then the question becomes really, the question of trauma is not the original trauma anymore, but you're bracing yourself against feeling all that stuff again. And because you don't allow yourself to go there, it still sits there and it festers inside of you. And so sooner or later, you need to open it up. But to my mind, you don't open it up the way that the VA opens it up by blasting with the memory of the trauma. And you go there very gently and very carefully. And in the context of a lot of safety, so your body can feel safe, your body can feel calm. And you sort of go like, oh my God, that was so terrible. What happened, what I did, what I experienced. But the only way it's helpful is if you're in a very calm state of mind, so you can observe what happened back then with a feeling of self-compassion. And if you go back there too fast or too uncontrolled, you just relive all that stuff, and you just get traumatized.
Which is the essence of a flashback, right? I
Right.
mean, is that what the flashback is? The sense that I'm reliving it right now, and this is happening, and your whole body's reacting. You had a video that I recently watched of a woman who was experiencing a flashback, and it was like she was
Right.
back in that place. I mean, she was like, "Wow, that was so." And so many veterans have that same kind of reaction and response as
Yeah.
being back in the jungle or the desert, and that.
Right. And when that happens to you,
Yeah.
you feel you feel like an idiot. You feel ashamed about yourself. you feel embarrassed, you lock yourself up from other people because you don't want people to see how out of control you get. And so then you get this incredible alienation from the people around you. And then the only people who you feel safe with are people who have gone through the same experience as you did, which has its pros, but the thing against it is you get more and more locked up in that identity of I'm a combat veteran who has PTSD.
Well, and then it's, not recognizing and not understanding how the brain works, like what you've done in your work. It highlighted and just made sense. It's like, there's nothing wrong with me. My brain has changed. My body has changed. I've been impacted by this.
Right.
And that's what I love. And I think that your book is titled "The Body Keeps the Score." And because of your work, we now know that the trauma is stored in the body. It's in the body.
Yeah. But lived out in the body.
It's lived out in the body.
It's lived out in heartbreak and gut-wrenching sensations, basically. It's like, how do you feel? And that goes into yoga and qigong and tai chi and all those things that are actually extremely helpful. Feeling but the critical issue is you try to run away from it. At the same time, you feel alive when you go there, and so you get this very complex relationship to being in the war. Like every guy I've met who's a combat veteran, they feel so proud and they feel so angry at the same time. It's not like, oh God, it's behind me, I can go on with my life. It's always like there's a tremendous pull towards it at the same time. And so how do you say, yeah, that was an interesting experience. These days we do MDMA therapy, ecstasy, psychedelic therapy, and actually it turns out psychedelics looks very good in terms of helping people to get in that state of saying, yeah, that's what happened to me. It's not fun to go back there. It's not, like nothing wonderful about it. But the medications makes it just safe enough for you to feel this is what happened. I was 18 years old. I was 19. I did what I could. And then you get the self-compassion of this poor guy. He was so committed, so hardworking, and yet that went wrong. And I wish I could have helped him, but I couldn't. Just an 18-year-old kid. So you need to rearrange this relationship to yourself in a way.
So that's why we need to deal with the body, is because of that orientation. And when we're working with traumatized people, are there certain things in therapy, certain things that we can do that will be helpful in healing the trauma that we've experienced in the body?
Well, I think martial arts, as developed in China and Japan, were developed to help. They're crazy warlike people also over there. And so, but it's to me is that other cultures develop other techniques to help people. And so I think some of these Japanese techniques of taiko drumming and kendo and this very careful sword fighting, and it really helps your body to organize itself and to be focused and to be calm and to learn to really control that internal core and then get your muscles back in an organized way, in a flailing way, as you do in trauma. Of course, nobody has studied martial arts because the world is run by psychologists. Psychologists, they yak and give people drugs.
It's terrible. It's just like, there's so many beautiful therapies. You did one on yoga as well. And one of the pathways I did was yoga that helped to get me on the body. And you did an amazing study on yoga. Where it was shown to be very effective.
Study. Yeah? So we it's very hard to get these things funded. And so finally we did. And then it turned out that yoga was, in a very chronic group of people, was more effective than any medication that anybody ever studied.
Wow.
And, published in a nice psychiatric journal. And of course, then you hope that medication clinics will be transformed into yoga studios. Of course, that never happens. And so when people are married to, hey, we need to yak. They say, oh, that's just stupid new age stuff. Then you should be doing it. But of course, working with the body and making it feel calm is critical. And who knows that again? Boot camp, where you march together and you sing together and you do things in unison, and you get this tremendous sense of rhythmicity with other people. And that's, I love the songs of the U.S. Marine Corps. I have a record of it, actually. and go from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. You feel strong and you feel proud. And so singing with people and moving with people does give you a sense of agency and power.
Yes.
And to my mind, that is what we need to use to transform people back into a civilian life also.
I think that's such a big part when you were just mentioning, because that sense of agency and that sense of rhythm, we get in the military and we feel powerful. And one of the signature features of trauma is the feeling of powerlessness.
Absolutely.
I mean, those sense of agency, you feel immobile,
Yeah.
and it's like paralyzing. And anybody who's like, you can't do anything. I can't protect myself.
Right. Absolutely. And to complete, like, what the hell, like that giving up. You give up.
Yes.
That's the trauma. There's nothing like immobilization is at the core.
So how do we evoke that?
They keep people moving even when they're scared.
Yeah.
It's brilliant,
Yeah, it does. You face your fears. You're like, yeah, they keep going, and then you're like, but then we have to. It catches up to us. And so, how do we regain a sense of agency and moving traumatized people, traumatized veterans towards action?
See, and to my mind, there's many different ways, and so we come across different things. I happen to love theater.
We're in the same. I love. Okay. Yes.
And, you know, in theater, you need to embody another identity. Huh? So you know what it feels like to be somebody else, and then you need to say these lines that can be very upsetting for you. But you need to say your lines, and you become part of a new group of people. Just like in the military, you're part of your acting platoon, and if you don't show up for your play rehearsal, the play doesn't go on. You're a necessary person. What happens after you come home from the war as a soldier? Nobody needs you. Nobody wants you. You're just this crazy person who came back from this. So the sense of belonging and being an important part of the whole deal is missing. But once you join a music group, or to my mind, even better, acting, you become part of a system, and you need to embody different roles. And that's why I'm involved in quite a few of the Shakespearean acting groups, where you get to say things like, let's say, one of my favorite lines, Lady Macbeth said, as she blackmails her husband, basically says, if you don't kill your boss, the king, I'll never have sex with you again. And this poor guy, he doesn't want to kill the general, and so he doesn't want to do it. And wife shorts him on, and she says to him, "If he had also resembled my father, I would have done the deed myself." And so you play that role of this evil lady, and you say, "Who is your father?" And you get to feel, if he had so resembled my father, you get to feel the lines. And say, "My father, oh, my father did terrible things. If he had also resembled my father, I would have done the deed myself." Did you ever think about killing your dad? Does your dad know how angry you are with him? And so you embody these roles, and you really very deeply feel it in your body. And you get help to really tolerate very intense emotions and to act them out in a very controlled way.
Well, I love the theater, and that's one of the things that I did my master's work on, was on using theater the way the ancient Greeks did, because the ancient Greeks, they were veterans guys that wrote those plays were
Yep.
generals and foot soldiers, and it was to achieve catharsis for both survivors and the community.
And
And
they really saw it. Huh? That's the other part is that, you know, uh, right now in our society, you go off to war, and people really basically don't know what's going on with you. You know, they know what happens on Netflix, but they don't know what happens with you. And so your story doesn't get told.
Mhm.
And certainly with the professional army right now, everybody says, "Oh, the military is so great, you get bored first." But in fact, it's a completely different segment of the society, and you don't get to play out for people. This is what happened to me. This is my experience, and I think that's another. We do theater groups with inner city kids also, and have them write their plays, and to say this is what my life is like,
Mhm. Mhm.
and to tell people this is what I went through,
Mhm.
and to embody it, and to play each other's roles, and to not only play your own role, but to play somebody else. To say that's what you went through, and
Mhm.
to feel that you're not alone in this, and people have different experiences. Very rich.
It gives people an opportunity to really stand back and be the observer of their life,
Yeah,
and to almost watch it as a character in a story
yeah,
in a movie, and you're actually getting to watch it and see it. And I believe, from
yeah.
my experience of the theater, it evokes compassion. You feel compassion for that person on the stage.
And indeed, and that capacity to look at yourself from somewhat of a distance is a critical element of getting your life together.
Mhm.
But when you feel traumatized, you're in it. And somebody says, "Oh, let's think about what's going on." And so you need to develop that capacity indeed to observe yourself, huh? And to really say, "Oh, you're at it again, Bessel."
And I think that's such an important part of helping us to gain self-regulation, to gain
Yeah,
regulation of our emotions again, and especially if we're living in a survival mode. We don't have a friendly relationship. We're disconnected from our body, our emotions. We're living in that trauma, which is pre-verbal, and we're caught up in that. And so, if we don't have self-regulation, how can we learn how to self-regulate without having to resort to things like alcohol, things
right,
like
right.
uh, medications, those kinds of things? What can we do?
Let me put in a little plug there, huh? Because that was actually one of the really important discoveries that I made for myself, at least, and that is that we have inborn systems inside of ourselves to regulate ourselves. And when you have kids and you're a thoughtful parent, you teach these kids, let's sing now. Good kindergarten teachers know it. I say, now we're going to take a little nap. And now we're going to sing a little bit. And now we're going to make some drawings. And now we're going to move and throw basketballs. And so there's things we can do to regulate ourselves. And so you wanted to ask me at the end for my dream for the future. I'll tell it to you now. My dream for the future is that in every school in America, they teach the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self-regulation. And self-regulation is a course starting in kindergarten. And every year you learn more techniques on how can I own myself, regulate myself, calm myself down, both scientifically and experientially. Let's see what happens when we do yoga. Let's see what happens when we do qigong. Let's see what happens when we sing. How does it affect you? What does it affect you when you look at me and you smile at me? And how does it affect you? And then you growl at me and say, how does it affect you? And so to really learn how we affect each other, but also how we can regulate ourselves. And if we don't do that, will become more and more of a drug-addicted society.
Yeah,
Because we
absolutely.
deeply a post-alcoholic culture where basically say, let it go away by taking something, putting a pill into their mouth.
Mhm.
And that is not necessary. That's a
I
dream.
agree. And I love your 4 R's. I think that's great. I love the dream because we don't know that. And sometimes because the veterans that are coming back, they don't have that ability to self-regulate because they're traumatized. It ends up affecting their children. And a core issue of trauma is whether we feel safe. and have a home to go to that brings us a sense of security. And if children of veterans don't feel safe at home because of domestic violence, traumatized veteran parents, addiction, or a combination of these, how much more likely is that child brought up in this environment to develop PTSD or health issues when they become adults?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, that is really the big issue, is the intergenerational transmission of trauma. You know, it's the opening story of my book. Liz Stanley, who you may also know, who was an army officer who wrote a
Yes.
book. Uh, she talks about every generation of my family has fought since the Revolutionary War in some war. And I was an officer. But there was always drinking, there was always violence. And so just because your parents are in the military and they do terrible things to you, doesn't mean that you won't join the military, because the military was still the glamorous part of their lives. They say, oh, maybe if I join the military, I'll become glamorous also and get that good part of mom or dad, you know, like. Um, but it's huge, and you know, I see this all the time in my practice about people whose parents were off to the war and were either absent, which is very painful,
Mhm.
to have a dad who just sits there drinking or not doing anything, working all the time. Um, but you feel unseen, you feel unloved, you feel unknown, and then the same person blows up from time to time, and it has a huge impact on people. Yeah.
Do children process traumas differently than adults?
Uh, in a way, because they don't have perspective.
Mm.
But for when you're a kid, what you see is what you get. So if something, you also, kids are totally egocentric. So
Mm.
everything is about them. It's a little bit like our president, like. Um, and so when something bad happens to a kid, the kid feels like, oh, this is happening because I'm a bad kid. And so every child who I know who has been abused incorporates that abuse in their self-concept.
Mhm.
That I'm the sort of kid who gets beaten, who gets molested. And there's not a kid who will say, man, I was living in this crazy household, people did these terrible things to me, but I was really a wonderful kid.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so part of the treatment of trauma is to actually get to a position where you go like, oh, I was this wonderful kid. Too bad my parents didn't get to really enjoy this wonderful kid. They had a chance and they blew it.
Yeah, they did. Well, I love one of the things that you talk about too is how to get to a person to a place where they can see that as a child or see that and then coming in and rescuing them or coming in and holding, I've got you. I'm going to take care of you now, and being able to separate themselves from the trauma in such a way that they can come in and take control or take back or could you talk about that just a little
But
bit?
you say it very well. I mean, that is the capacity to actually take care of yourself, your younger self,
Mhm.
is very central. And but we do it also in psychodrama, where somebody we set things up. It's actually my favorite therapeutic practice, where your parents are in the room and you have all these feelings with your parents, and then you say, so, but you choose somebody who you wish had been your dad when you were 3 years old, and you choose that person, and and we have trained people to be good actors by this time, and you say, how would you like this person to hold you? And we arrange it in the body, and then that person says, if I'd been your dad when you were 3 years old, I would have held you like that. I've been on the receiving end of that also. Um, it's a profound experience. And you go like, oh my God, if somebody would have helped me like this, if somebody would, and you start re-scripting your life.
Mm.
Um, and so I'm a much more experiential person than most therapist type people. I think people need to have the experience to feel on a very deep level, oh, that's what it feels like to feel safe. Oh, that's what it feels like when somebody cares for you without trying to molest you. But that's what it means when you really feel safe with somebody, but on the somatic level almost. Yeah, yeah.
Does this change the neuroplasticity of our brains when we do things like this? Is it rewire it in ways that so that we can feel safe? Those internal structures in our brain help us to feel safe again.
Yeah, see, that's what we postulate. That's what we think happens.
Mm.
Of course, nobody at this point is giving this sort of money out. So it's interesting. The funding of PTSD is all about to find out how screwed up you are. Oh, that system doesn't work. That system doesn't. Oh, the cytokines. Oh, that memory system. And so all this research has been done to find out how deeply messed up you are when you have PTSD. But the money doesn't go into the very question that you ask. Is so when you have these experiences where people say, "I now feel safe," uh, what happens in the brain?
Mhm.
And of course, right now with my new foundation, that is what we hope to really promote, is to really do pre-post studies, and not only to see do people feel better, but what happens to these neuronal pathways when you have these experiences. But up to now, the National Institute of Health and I think the VA have not funded stuff like that.
No, they tend to stick with evidence-based therapies that
Oh, can can I say something about evidence-based
I
therapies?
would love to. Yes, please.
Like I am as totally in favor of evidence-based treatment. I think we should. If somebody says they have a great technique, I say, show me the data that it works.
Yeah.
Trouble is, something happened politically, and that's that the world went out for evidence-based, and then about 1995, some of the simplest treatment techniques, people said, "Oh, I found proven that it works," and then they closed the barn door. And they said, we now have an evidence-based treatment that works better than if you do nothing. That doesn't mean you have a good treatment. It means you have a treatment that is better than doing nothing. But at this point, the barn door got closed and people stopped looking for other modes of treatment. And it's just, and now all the people who have these original evidence-based treatments are on the review panels and say, and when you propose something new, you go like, but we already have all the answers because we found this evidence-based treatment. And so with that, the curiosity stopped about what else can we do.
Mhm.
So my friends who do Shakespeare theater, I don't think they're going to get money to study that. Uh, I am a very serious neurofeedback researcher and have been able to get money together to do 3 studies on it. Extremely hard to get the money from private sources and my own income stuff. We show that neurofeedback is a spectacularly effective treatment. I've gone to NIH 7 times to get a study funded.
That's terrible.
So indeed, we need to develop more evidence-based treatments, but most treatments that we have are pretty complicated.
Mhm.
And so to learn to have that self-compassionate attitude that is so critical, and to really get to that place, you don't do that in 8 sessions. Not breaking their finger, that takes time.
Yeah.
Spiritual journey, you know. Um, and so uh, at this point, there's, and so my book was very much about it. So say that works and that works and that, and this is what we know, this is what we don't know yet, to very much inspire people to really open up their minds to explore more and deeper treatments for people. Yeah.
Well, what would you recommend? What are some type of therapies that you found to be most effective in helping veterans?
Um, I think number one is talking to other veterans.
Hmm.
I think some way of reestablishing the peer group and peer
Mhm.
support is terribly important. And that's how we started. And one of the things that evolved, which I'm very unhappy about, is that everything became professionalized. So, as a fellow Marine, I wouldn't go to you, who knows what it's like to be walking up in the middle of the night. I go to some little social worker who just comes out of school, who doesn't know anything about combat, because she's licensed to do evidence-based treatment. But but being with people who really know what it's like, who struggle
Mhm.
with the same issues, is very important. But it shouldn't stop there. Huh? So then you should work together on trying certain things out. So that's what I've loved so much about the theater groups that I'm involved with, because people have little apps and they communicate with each other on the telephone. And somebody may say in the middle of the night, I'm just feeling so terrible. I feel like killing myself. But you have a friend who you can contact. They will be there for each other. And it's not like you don't have hundreds of people. You just have a small group of people, just like a platoon in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to become a therapeutic place where people can learn to share things and to discover things and to find ways of getting better. So the group may be focusing on learning martial arts, or may go on an outward bound program, or may go on a music making program, or may go on a equine therapy program.
Mm-hmm.
Equine therapy is wonderful also. But that peer group continues to be a very important thing throughout life.
Well, and they did a lot in the when you were first started working with veterans. I think there was a lot of peer groups, because I think the Vietnam veterans, didn't they organize themselves in that way?
Right.
Kind of gone away from that a little bit.
But, see, I'm not so much in touch with sort of what's happening right now, but my sense is that both in the Vietnam community and in the child abuse community and the incest, it's not nearly doesn't nearly have the sort of peer group support that we had 40 years ago when we started. And my organization is very much promoting people forming that. And actually, we're actually working with some Chinese people who have a peer support system in China consisting of over 1 million people to teach us how to set up peer support networks in the US.
But what I think about, what about peer support groups is that it helps you to break the silence. It helps you to be able to break that, because that silence can be deafening, and it can crush you.
Yeah.
And it could be, it leads you to hopelessness and helplessness and suicide and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, the isolation and the shame.
Yes.
To blow up, to do terrible things, and we do terrible things. Actually, traumatized, you hurt other people. You get so ashamed of yourself.
Yeah.
And so you need to have people who, when AA has that, of course. The 12-step programs are a very good basic model in some ways.
What do you think? I mean, we're coming to the close here on the show today, Dr. Van der Kolk, and with the veterans that are out there who are suffering from the shame and the stigma that's attached to it, that may be resistant to getting help because it's not a warrior attitude, strong man, strong woman. How can we help them to get over the stigma, to recognize that helping yourself on that internal world is going to help you to be a better warrior, a better father, a better mother, and to help them recognize that the injury is not their fault?
Well, that's why I wrote my book in part.
No, it's fantastic.
Like, this is what's going on with you, and here's some options you have. But I see, and you know more about it than I do, I see very good veterans programs everywhere. They're almost always done by good-hearted people who don't get any support from anybody else. But
That's so true.
It's really amazing. Like, I have friends who do a theater program in Wisconsin, wonderful theater program for veterans, and they say, "We're allowed to be in the VA. They gave us a room." I said, "Like what time?" "From 7 to 9 every Thursday. We're allowed to be in the VA." I said, "Are they paying you?" "No, of course not." So the guy who gives them drugs that don't work gets $200 an hour, but you don't get paid in the theater group. So it's all very troublesome. But they're there, And so then you get this whole issue of who has the initiative to look for things. And maybe that's probably what your program is about in some ways. Like when you look, I hang out with people called Songwriting for Soldiers. I hang out with people who do equine therapy. Hang out with people decruit. And so all these things have a website. You just need to find them.
That's true. What do you think? I mean, have you heard about SGB, stellate ganglion block? What are your thoughts about that?
the second person this week who asked me that. I'm agnostic about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm not going to say anything because you know, my skeptical self.
Skeptic.
Wants it. It's a high technique, high technology
Yeah.
technique. I am, and that's how I started off in life also. But I'm very much into creating organisms that can cope.
Hmm.
So I'm very much into helping people. Neurofeedback can do it, theater can do it, MDMA can do it, to create a new internal environment for themselves so they can cope with things. So when things get too highly technical, it's something that comes from the outside that does something to you. And um, my inclination is more, let's see what we can do to help you to regulate these things by yourself without putting stuff inside of you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's my basic prejudice. But boy, if it works, go for it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm in alignment with what you're saying is that being allowing your spirit, your soul, your mind, your body, your heart to become larger than the experience itself, so that you can contain it all, so that it's your own agency, your own power that is able to
But sometimes a pill to get a good night's sleep can be very helpful.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
What do you think are the good? What is the essence of a good at the core of good trauma therapy? I mean, what should people look for? Is it what's the essence of it? You think?
The essence is to really get to know you. I think who are you? What are your experiences? What it's like for you? Uh, and what were you hoping you would become and what has come of it? And to really get to know yourself, somebody who really is curious about you and helps you to find language for who you are
Mm-hmm.
with all the bells and whistles, etc., etc. And then after really getting to know who you are, to find out, so that isn't working and that isn't working. And somebody who has a number of different techniques, as it were, to work with people. The techniques, to my mind, are very much knowing about working with the body,
Mm-hmm.
which people don't learn in school when you
Yep.
get lessons. So you need to get trained in that afterwards. I find EMDR as a basic technique incredibly helpful. Uh, it's not, it's not, oh, if you just do EMDR, everything will get resolved. But EMDR is a very helpful thing for many people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so EMDR is helpful. And then hopefully, uh, and also somebody who understands that we are complex creatures and that you're not just a soldier and you're not just an angry guy, you're not just a compassionate person who runs a radio show. The person who has tea right now is not the person who your wife knows.
Mm-hmm.
You have a wife. No, I
No,
hope
I
she
know. But yeah,
tonight. But she also knows that you have an angry part and a controlling part and a scary part, And so we are very complex creatures. And to know that different parts of us come out under different circumstances. And to get to know the complex creatures that live inside of us and how we try to cope with the world and how we got to cope with the world. So there's a long explanation of something called internal family system therapy, where you work with the internal system that we all live with.
do you think it's important for us to be able to get to the truth, to be able to speak the truth of what happened to us? And do we have to be re-traumatized to do that? Can we eventually get to a place? Is that important in our healing?
Yeah, I think coming to the truth is important. To be able to at least say to yourself, this is what happened to me,
Mhm.
and this is how I behaved. And also, one of the hardest things about trauma is not so much what happened to you, but how you reacted to it. That you blew up or committed atrocities and did terrible things or didn't step up or were too scared to intervene where you should have intervened, and to really go there and to say, yeah, at that point in my life, I could not do any better than I did. And I feel very disappointed that I, back then, but now I would behave differently. But to really develop this sense of self-compassion for who you were when you did not know how to find a solution.
I think it's brilliant.
Imagine if I knew what I know now, back then,
Yeah.
how you would have done things differently.
It's such a big thing. I mean, I can't tell you how, when my healing process and when I had to go, that was like, if I knew what I knew, but you had to go through all of that stuff to get to know what you know
No, you
now,
were just
to be able to look back.
But yeah.
Dr. Van der Kolk, this has been an honor. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. I just have one last question before we sign off for today. It has been such an honor. Dr. Van der Kolk, if you could give one piece of advice, one bit of wisdom from your life experience, what would it be?
I think what comes to mind, there's this line from a poet, that you just have to learn to love that creature inside of yourself. You don't have to prove anything. That to really, our job in life is to take care of that creature that we inhabit. Mm-hmm. That nobody else is going to do it for us. Huh? So we need to take care of this person who you may think is a piece of shit right now. The only thing you take care of it, man. Just like, what does this creature need? Not in terms of just exciting things, but fundamentally, just like when you have a baby, this baby needs to be held, needs to be nurtured, needs to, etc., etc. So at the end, it's really learning to take care of this creature.
Brilliant. Thank you. It has been an honor and a privilege. Folks, the body keeps a score. It is outstanding. He is the best in the world. Folks, thank you so much for tuning into the council. May you all be well. May you all be free of pain and suffering. May you all be whole. God bless.
Thank you. Take care.